"This room's ours now," my daughter-in-law declared, her voice cutting through 70 years of my life like a rusty blade. The words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. I stood there in my own home, feeling like a stranger in the place where I had raised my children, loved my husband, and built every dream I ever dared to have. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 70 years old, I thought I understood what family meant. I lived in a 3-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn Heights, the same one my late husband Robert and I had purchased 45 years ago with every penny we could scrape together. The morning light still streamed through the same windows where we used to watch the sunrise together, sharing coffee and dreams of the future. The hardwood floors still creaked in all the familiar places, and the kitchen still smelled faintly of the apple pies I used to bake every Sunday. But on that particular Tuesday in September, everything changed. I was wearing my favorite sweater, the lavender one Robert had given me for our 35th anniversary, when my son Michael and his wife Sandra walked into my living room with boxes and measuring tape. They moved through my space like they owned it, which I suppose they thought they did. The triggering moment came when Sandra looked at me with those cold blue eyes and said those 5 words that would haunt my dreams for months to come. "This room's ours now." She gestured toward my bedroom, the sanctuary where Robert and I had shared 42 years of marriage, where I had nursed him through his final illness, where I still kept his reading glasses on the nightstand because some mornings I forgot he was gone. I remember my knees trembling, not from age, but from the shock of being dismissed so casually in my own home. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could hear the old oak floorboards groaning under my feet as if they too were protesting this injustice. My hands shook as I reached for the door frame, needing something solid to hold onto as my world shifted beneath me. You see, this wasn't supposed to be how family worked. I had always believed that home was sacred, that the people who loved you would protect the spaces where your heart lived. But standing there, watching Sandra measure my bedroom for new furniture, I realized that my understanding of family had been nothing more than a beautiful delusion. The apartment held so many memories. In the living room, there was still a small dent in the wall where Michael had thrown a baseball when he was 8 years old. I had never fixed it because it reminded me of his laughter, the way he used to run to me for comfort when he scraped his knee. The kitchen window still bore the tiny handprints of my grandchildren from years past, pressed against the glass as they watched for their grandfather to come home from work. But Sandra saw none of that history. To her, I was just an aging obstacle standing in the way of her plans for modernization and expansion. She spoke about me as if I wasn't in the room, discussing storage solutions for my belongings and timeline estimates for the renovation. Her voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned her right to take what she wanted. Michael stood silent beside his wife, avoiding my eyes. This was my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep through countless nights when he had nightmares. The young man I had worked double shifts to put through college, the groom whose wedding I had paid for when his father's illness had drained our savings. He said nothing as his wife cataloged my possessions like items at an estate sale. I wanted to scream, to demand they leave, to assert my rights as the woman whose name was still on the deed. But the words caught in my throat like thorns. Years of being gradually pushed to the margins of my own family had trained me to swallow my protests, to smile and nod, even when my heart was breaking. That evening, after they left with their boxes and their plans, I sat alone in the growing darkness of my living room. I didn't turn on the lights because I couldn't bear to see how empty the space already felt. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of traffic on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway and the occasional siren wailing through the night. I picked up an old photo album from the coffee table, one that Sandra had marked with a sticky note reading, "Donate or discard." My fingers traced the faces of people who had once filled this home with love and laughter. There was Robert on our wedding day, so young and handsome in his Navy uniform. There was Michael taking his first steps across this very living room. There were birthday parties and Christmas mornings, graduations and celebrations, all the moments that had made this house a home. But as I flipped through those pages, I began to see a different story emerging. In the more recent photos, I noticed how I had gradually been pushed to the edges of family gatherings. At Michael's promotion party 3 years ago, I was barely visible in the background. At my granddaughter's birthday last year, I was seated at the children's table, while Sandra's mother presided over the adult conversation. The pattern was clear once I allowed myself to see it. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever looked around at the people you love most and realized they see you as nothing more than a burden to be managed? The signs had been there for years, but I had chosen to ignore them in favor of keeping the peace. Every time Sandra made a subtle comment about my old-fashioned ways, I had smiled and changed the subject. Every time Michael forgot to call on important days, I had made excuses for his busy schedule. Every time I was excluded from family decisions, I had told myself they were just trying to spare me the worry. But lying alone in my bed that night, staring at the ceiling where Robert and I had once planned to install a skylight so we could watch the stars together, I finally admitted the truth I had been avoiding. My family didn't see me as a beloved matriarch deserving of respect and consideration. They saw me as an elderly woman who was in their way, whose needs and feelings were secondary to their ambitions and convenience. The next morning brought a phone call that crystallized everything. Sandra's voice was bright and cheerful as she explained that they had already contacted a contractor about expanding the bedroom and converting my small office into a nursery. They were planning their future around the assumption that I would simply disappear or comply without question. "We thought you'd be excited about having the baby so close by," she said, as if she were doing me a favor by erasing my personal space to accommodate their growing family. "And don't worry about your things. We'll find somewhere to put everything important." Important to whom, I wondered. Who would decide what pieces of my life were worth preserving? Would they keep the quilt my mother had made by hand? Or would it end up in a donation bag because it didn't match their modern aesthetic? Would they understand that Robert's old desk wasn't just furniture, but the place where he had written love letters to me throughout our marriage? I had spent 45 years building wealth slowly and carefully, working as a teacher while Robert managed our small investments in stocks and even some cryptocurrency that our financial advisor had recommended. Our modest fortune wasn't millions, but it was enough to ensure I could live comfortably for the rest of my days. Yet increasingly, I felt pressure to share that money with Michael and Sandra, to fund their lifestyle improvements and investment opportunities, while my own needs were treated as afterthoughts. The morning after that phone call, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee from the chipped mug that Robert had used every day for 20 years. The familiar weight of it in my hands usually brought comfort, but today it felt like holding on to the past while the present slipped away from me. I could hear the upstairs neighbors starting their day, the sound of children getting ready for school, the normal rhythms of life continuing around me while my world crumbled. I realized that this wasn't just about a bedroom or even about living arrangements. This was about power and respect, about who had the right to make decisions about my life and my home. For too long, I had handed over that power piece by piece, thinking I was being generous and loving. But generosity without boundaries had become exploitation, and love without respect had become manipulation. The history of my sacrifices stretched back decades, a long trail of giving that had started with the best of intentions. When Michael was young and struggling to get established in his career, I had helped with rent payments and grocery money. When he married Sandra, I had paid for their honeymoon because they couldn't afford it themselves. When their first child was born, I had provided the crib, the stroller, the car seat, and countless other necessities without being asked to contribute. I had been proud to help, viewing my financial support as an expression of maternal love and generosity. But somewhere along the way, that help had transformed from gift to expectation. My contributions were no longer appreciated gestures, but assumed entitlements. When I had suggested reducing my monthly payments last year due to some unexpected medical expenses, Sandra had looked at me with barely concealed irritation and suggested I reassess my priorities. The emotional sacrifices had been even more costly than the financial ones. I had swallowed years of subtle insults disguised as helpful suggestions. "Mom, maybe you should consider updating your wardrobe," Sandra would say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Those styles are so dated." Or, "Eleanor, you really should think about joining a senior center. It would be good for you to spend time with people your own age. Each comment was a small cut, easily dismissed in isolation but collectively creating a deep wound in my self-esteem. I began to second-guess my choices, my opinions, even my right to take up space in conversations. Family dinners became exercises in careful navigation, where I learned to agree quickly and avoid topics that might invite criticism. The breaking point had been building for months before that Tuesday in September. It started with small boundary violations that I had initially overlooked. Sandra began rearranging my kitchen to suit her preferences when she came to visit. She would move my coffee maker to a different counter, reorganize my spice cabinet, and replace my familiar brands with products she considered superior. "I'm just trying to help you get more organized," she would say when I gently protested. "These systems work so much better." But her help felt like erasure, a systematic removal of my preferences and choices from my own living space. Then, there were the conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, the family group texts that somehow never included me, the spontaneous gatherings I learned about after the fact through social media posts. Each exclusion was explained away as an oversight or attributed to my supposed inability to keep up with modern technology. But I wasn't confused or incompetent. I was being deliberately marginalized by people who found my presence inconvenient to their narrative of themselves as independent, successful adults. They wanted the benefits of my support, without the responsibility of including me as an equal participant in the family I had created and nurtured. The financial pressure had intensified over the past year as Michael and Sandra's lifestyle became increasingly expensive. They had moved to a larger house in an upscale neighborhood, enrolled their children in private schools, and taken on investment opportunities that required significant capital. Each new expense became my emergency to solve. "Mom, we're a little short this month," became a regular refrain, always delivered with the assumption that my resources were naturally available to bridge their gaps. When I had attempted to discuss boundaries around financial support, Michael had looked hurt and confused. "I thought we were family," he said, as if my reluctance to fund their choices was a betrayal of maternal duty. "Dad always said you'd take care of us." But Robert had never intended for me to become an endless source of financial support, with no reciprocal consideration for my own needs and dignity. He had wanted me to be generous, yes, but not at the expense of my self-respect and security. Standing in my bedroom that September morning, looking at the measuring tape marks Sandra had left on my walls, I finally understood that I had been collaborating in my own diminishment. Every time I had swallowed an insult, overlooked a slight, or provided money without question, I had reinforced the dynamic that led to this moment. I thought about Robert and what he would say if he could see how our son was treating the woman he had loved and respected for over 4 decades. Robert had always defended me, always ensured that my voice was heard and valued in our household decisions. He would be heartbroken to know that I had allowed myself to become a secondary character in my own life story. That afternoon, I called my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez, an 80-year-old widow who had become a dear friend over the past few years. Unlike my family, she always greeted me with genuine warmth and interest in my thoughts and feelings. When I told her what had happened, her reaction was immediate and fierce. "Mija, they cannot just take your bedroom," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "This is your house, your home. You don't owe them your dignity just because they are family." Her validation was like water to a woman dying of thirst. For so long, I had been gaslit into believing that my feelings were unreasonable, that my needs were selfish, that my desire for respect was somehow inappropriate for a woman my age. But Mrs. Rodriguez saw the situation clearly, without the emotional complications that had clouded my judgment. We talked for hours that evening, sitting on my small balcony overlooking the East River as the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline. She shared stories of her own struggles with family members who had tried to take advantage of her after her husband's death. She had learned to say no, to set boundaries, to demand respect even from people she loved. "Love without respect is not love at all," she told me as we watched the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness. "It is just need and convenience dressed up in pretty words." Her words echoed in my mind as I tried to sleep that night. I kept thinking about all the times I had accepted less than respectful treatment in the name of keeping the family together. But what was I really keeping together? A facade of happiness that required me to disappear a little more each day? The next morning brought another revelation. While cleaning out some old files, I discovered a conversation thread on Michael's phone that he had left on my kitchen counter. I didn't mean to violate his privacy, but the screen lit up with a text from Sandra that made my blood run cold. "Once we get her moved out of the master bedroom, we can start phase 2, the message read. "The financial advisor says we need to get power of attorney before she gets too attached to managing her own investments. She's already showing signs of confusion about money matters." There it was, in black and white. They weren't just planning to take my bedroom. They were planning to take control of my entire life. The alleged confusion about money matters was a complete fabrication, a pretext for seizing control of the assets Robert and I had spent decades building through careful saving and smart investments in stocks, bonds, and even some cryptocurrency that had performed surprisingly well. I sat in my kitchen, holding that phone, feeling like the ground had opened up beneath me. This wasn't just about space or convenience. This was a calculated campaign to render me powerless in my own life. They were planning to paint me as incompetent to justify taking control of everything I had worked for and valued. The betrayal was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. These were the people I had loved and supported unconditionally, the family for whom I had sacrificed my own needs and desires countless times. And they were plotting to strip me of my independence and dignity as if I were already dead. I put the phone down with trembling hands and walked to the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had allowed herself to become a victim, but she didn't have to remain one. I was 70 years old, not senile. I was financially stable, not dependent. I was the legal owner of this apartment, not a guest who could be evicted at will. For the first time in months, I felt something other than hurt and confusion. I felt angry, good, clean, clarifying anger that burned away the fog of self-doubt and revealed the situation with perfect clarity. They were counting on my passivity, my desire to avoid conflict, my fear of being alone, but they had underestimated the strength that comes from finally seeing the truth. That evening, I made several phone calls. First, I called my bank to verify that all my accounts were still in my name only. Then I called my financial advisor to discuss protecting my investment portfolio from unauthorized access. Finally, I called a lawyer who specialized in elder law to understand my rights and options. Each conversation reinforced what I already knew but hadn't been willing to acknowledge. I was not powerless. I had resources, legal protections, and choices. The only thing standing between me and my dignity was my own unwillingness to enforce boundaries with people who had proven they would not respect voluntary limits. The lawyer, a kind woman named Patricia who reminded me of my younger self, was both supportive and direct. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "you have every right to live in your own home without intrusion or coercion. No one can force you to give up your bedroom or sign over financial control unless you choose to do so." She explained the legal protections available to me, the steps I could take to secure my assets, and the documentation I should maintain to prove my mental competency. For the first time in months, I felt like I had allies in addition to my own inner strength. But that night, as I lay in the bed Robert and I had shared for so many years, I also felt the full weight of my isolation. Setting boundaries with family members who refused to respect them meant accepting that our relationships might never recover. I was choosing my dignity over their comfort, my autonomy over their convenience, and the cost of that choice felt enormous. I thought about the grandchildren who had been gradually taught to see me as less important than their other relatives. Would I lose access to them entirely if I refused to be bulldozed by their parents? Would they remember me as the grandmother who stood up for herself, or as the difficult old woman who caused problems for the family? The uncertainty was agonizing, but the alternative was worse. If I allowed this pattern to continue, I would disappear entirely, becoming nothing more than a source of resources for people who had stopped seeing me as a complete human being, deserving of respect and consideration. Sleep eluded me that night, but the sleeplessness felt different from the anxious insomnia I had experienced for months. This was the alertness of a woman preparing for battle, not the helpless worry of a victim with no options. I was done being managed, manipulated, and marginalized. The question was no longer whether I would fight back, but how. The answer came to me in the quiet hours before dawn, as I watched the first light creep across the East River. I would not argue or plead or justify my right to dignity and respect. I would simply assert it, clearly and calmly, with the full force of my legal rights and financial independence behind me. When Michael and Sandra arrived the next morning with their contractor and their measuring tapes, I was ready for them. I had spent the early hours of the morning documenting my assets, securing my important papers, and preparing for the conversation that would change everything between us. They walked into my apartment with the casual confidence of people who had never been seriously challenged by me. Sandra was already pointing out features to the contractor, discussing wall removal and fixture placement as if the space belonged to her. Michael was nodding along, occasionally glancing at me with the patronizing smile I had learned to hate. "Mom, we brought Jim to take some measurements," he said, gesturing toward the contractor. "This is all going to work out great. You'll see." I stood in the center of my living room, wearing my best dress and the pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look like the competent, dignified woman I was, not the confused elderly person they were trying to paint me as. "There won't be any measurements taken today," I said clearly, "and there won't be any construction in my bedroom or anywhere else in my apartment." The contractor looked confused, glancing between me and Michael uncertainly. Sandra's smile faltered, and Michael's eyebrows drew together in the expression of patient condescension he used when he thought I was being difficult. "Mom, we talked about this yesterday," he said in the tone one might use with a confused child. "You agreed that the bedroom renovation would be good for everyone." "I agreed to no such thing," I replied, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "I listened while you made plans for my home without consulting me." "That's not the same as agreement." Sandra stepped forward with the bright, aggressive smile she used when she wanted to steamroll opposition. "Eleanor, we're all family here. We're just trying to make the space work better for everyone. Don't you want what's best for the grandchildren?" I had heard variations of this argument countless times before. My needs and preferences were always framed as selfish obstacles to the greater family good. But today, I was ready with a response that had been building inside me for years. What's best for the grandchildren is having a grandmother who models self-respect and healthy boundaries, I said. What's best for this family is learning that love doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity to make other people comfortable. The room fell silent except for the awkward shifting of the contractor, who clearly wanted to escape this family drama. Michael and Sandra exchanged glances, communicating in the shorthand of couples who had discussed how to handle my difficult moods. "Mom, you're being unreasonable," Michael said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "We're not asking for much. Just a little flexibility to make this work for everyone." "You're asking for my bedroom," I replied. "You're asking me to give up the most private and personal space in my own home to accommodate your plans." "How is that a little flexibility?" Sandra's mask of cheerful manipulation was starting to slip. "We have growing needs, Eleanor. The family is expanding, and we need more space. Surely you can understand that your needs aren't the only ones that matter." There it was, the core assumption that had been driving their behavior for years. My needs didn't matter as much as theirs. My comfort was less important than their convenience. My home was a resource for them to allocate according to their priorities. "You're absolutely right," I said, and I saw them relax slightly, thinking they had won. "Your needs do matter. That's why you should meet them in your own home, not mine." The contractor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe I should come back another time when you folks have worked things out." "That won't be necessary," I told him kindly. "There won't be any construction here, but thank you for your time." As he gathered his tools and headed for the door, I could see Michael's face darkening with frustration. He wasn't used to me standing firm, and he clearly didn't like it. Sandra was calculating, her sharp eyes moving between me and Michael as she recalibrated her approach. "Eleanor, I think you're having trouble understanding the situation," Sandra said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. "Maybe we should sit down and go through this more slowly." The implications were clear. I was old, confused, possibly suffering from cognitive decline that made me unable to grasp simple concepts. It was a narrative they had been building for months, laying the groundwork for the power of attorney grab I had discovered in their text messages. But I had prepared for this too. From my purse, I pulled out a letter from my doctor confirming my mental competency, dated just 2 days earlier. I had requested the evaluation specifically to protect myself against false claims of confusion or dementia. I understand the situation perfectly, I said, handing the letter to Michael. I also understand that you and Sandra have been discussing ways to gain financial control over my assets by claiming I'm incompetent to manage them myself. The color drained from both their faces. They hadn't expected me to know about their plans, and they certainly hadn't expected me to take steps to protect myself. The power dynamic that had allowed them to manipulate me for years shifted dramatically in that moment. "Mom, that's not... We would never..." Michael stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. He knew I had evidence of their intentions, and denial was pointless. "You would never what?" I asked. "Take advantage of an elderly family member who trusted you? Manipulate someone into signing away their independence? Plan to seize assets that don't belong to you?" Sandra recovered first, switching tactics from patronization to emotional manipulation. "We're hurt that you would think so poorly of us," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "After everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed to make sure you're taken care of." I almost laughed at the audacity of that claim. What had they sacrificed? They had received thousands of dollars in financial support, free babysitting, help with household tasks, and emotional labor that I had provided without being asked. Meanwhile, I had sacrificed my independence, my self-respect, and increasingly my right to exist comfortably in my own home. "What exactly have you sacrificed for me?" I asked. Because from where I stand, this relationship has been entirely one-sided. I give, you take. I adapt, you demand. I compromise, you expect more. Michael tried a different approach, appealing to guilt and family obligation. "Dad would be disappointed in you," he said, invoking his father's memory like a weapon. "He always said family comes first." The mention of Robert hit me like a physical blow, but not in the way Michael intended. Instead of guilt, I felt a surge of protective anger. Robert had loved me fiercely and completely, defending me against any criticism or disrespect. He would be appalled to see how his son was treating the woman he had cherished for 42 years. "Your father would be disappointed," I agreed, "but not in me. He would be disgusted by the way you've spoken to me, the way you've dismissed my feelings, the way you've tried to steal my dignity piece by piece." I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up my favorite photo of Robert, taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. He was looking at me with such love and pride, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture of protection and partnership. "Your father respected me," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "He valued my opinions, included me in decisions, and treated me as an equal partner in our marriage and family. He would never have asked me to give up my bedroom so someone else could have it." Sandra made one last attempt at manipulation, her voice taking on a saccharine quality that made my skin crawl. "We just want to take care of you, Eleanor. We worry that you're isolated here, that you might fall or have an accident with no one around to help." It was a common refrain used to justify taking control of elderly people's lives. The false concern, the manufactured worry, the implication that independence was dangerous and should be surrendered for the illusion of safety. But I had lived independently for 70 years, through war and recession, illness and loss, and I was not about to give up my autonomy now. "If you were genuinely concerned about my welfare," I said, "you would ask what I need to feel safe and supported. You wouldn't assume that what I need is to surrender my personal space and financial control to people who have shown they don't respect my judgment." I paused, looking at their faces, seeing the calculation behind their concern. They weren't worried about my safety. They were frustrated by my inconvenient insistence on maintaining my independence. "But since you brought up safety," I continued, "I should mention that I've installed a security system and changed the locks. From now on, visits need to be scheduled in advance and approved by me." The shock on their faces was complete. They had never imagined that I would take concrete steps to protect myself from them. In their minds, I was a passive resource to be managed, not an autonomous person capable of defending her own interests. Michael's face flushed red with anger. You can't lock us out. We're your family. Family members who respect each other don't need locks, I replied. Family members who plot to steal bedrooms and financial control, however, have forfeited the right to unlimited access. Sandra finally dropped her mask of false concern entirely. You're making a huge mistake, Eleanor. We won't forget this. And when you're lying alone in some nursing home because you were too stubborn to accept help, don't come crying to us. The threat was clear and vicious, designed to terrify me into compliance. The implication was that without their conditional love and support, I would end up abandoned and helpless. But instead of fear, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Thank you for finally being honest, I said. Now I know exactly where I stand. Your love and support come with conditions that require me to surrender my dignity and independence. That's not love, Sandra. That's control. Michael made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Mom, please, let's not end things like this. We can work something out that makes everyone happy. But I was done trying to make everyone happy at my own expense. Happiness built on one person's diminishment isn't real happiness. It's just the temporary satisfaction of getting your way at someone else's expense. We can work something out, I agreed. You can treat me with respect, include me in family decisions as an equal, and stop trying to manage my life as if I'm incompetent. When you're ready to do that, we can talk. They left that day without another word, taking their measuring tapes and their plans with them. I stood at my window, watching them load their car with the aggressive movements of people who had been denied something they felt entitled to. As they drove away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Sadness at the confrontation, relief at finally standing up for myself, and uncertainty about what would come next. The silence in my apartment felt different than it had before. Instead of the oppressive quiet of someone being erased, it was the peaceful silence of a person who had reclaimed her space. I walked through each room, seeing it with new eyes. This was my home, filled with my memories, arranged according to my preferences, occupied by my presence without apology. That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez came by with homemade soup and a bottle of wine. We sat on my balcony, sharing the meal and processing the day's events. She raised her glass in a toast that made me laugh for the first time in weeks. To women who refuse to disappear, she said, and we clinked our glasses as the sun set over the river. The next few weeks were difficult but clarifying. Michael called several times, alternating between anger and attempts at reconciliation. Sandra sent text messages that ranged from accusations of selfishness to threats of cutting off all contact with the grandchildren. Each communication reinforced my conviction that I had made the right choice. But there were also unexpected sources of support. My youngest granddaughter, Emma, who was 15 and old enough to understand the situation, reached out to me directly. She had been watching the family dynamics for years and had her own feelings about her parents' treatment of me. Grandma, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, she texted me one evening. Mom and Dad act like you don't matter, but you do. You matter to me. Her validation meant more to me than I could express. For months, I had wondered if I was overreacting, if my hurt feelings were unjustified, if my desire for respect was somehow inappropriate. But Emma's perspective confirmed what I knew in my heart. I deserved better treatment from the people who claimed to love me. Other family members began to emerge from the shadows as word of our confrontation spread. My sister called from California, full of indignation on my behalf. I never liked Sandra, she said bluntly, and I'm disappointed in Michael for letting her treat you this way. My brother-in-law, Robert's younger brother who lived in Queens, stopped by for coffee and told me stories I had never heard about family members who had stood up to bullies and manipulators. The Williams family doesn't back down from bullies, he said with a grin. Robert would be proud of you. But the most significant support came from an unexpected source. My financial advisor, James, who had been managing my portfolio for 15 years. When I explained the situation and my concerns about protecting my assets, his reaction was immediate and protective. Mrs. Williams, you have substantial assets that need to be protected, he said, pulling up my account information on his computer screen. Between your pension, Social Security, the growth in your stock portfolio, and the appreciation of your cryptocurrency investments, you're actually quite wealthy. You don't need anyone to take care of you financially. I stared at the numbers on his screen, shocked by how much my careful savings and smart investments had grown over the years. I had been living modestly, focused on security rather than luxury, and hadn't realized how substantial my net worth had become. You mean I could live independently for the rest of my life, even if I needed expensive care? I asked. Mrs. Williams, you could live independently for several lifetimes, he said with a smile. You have enough assets to maintain your current lifestyle, hire any help you need, and still leave a substantial inheritance. You're not dependent on anyone. This revelation changed everything. I had been operating from a position of assumed vulnerability, believing that I needed my family's support to survive. But the reality was quite different. I was financially independent and capable of securing any assistance I might need without surrendering my autonomy. Armed with this knowledge, I felt even more confident about the boundaries I had established. I wasn't a burden who should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect my family was willing to provide. I was a successful, competent woman who had earned the right to be treated with dignity. The next phase of my liberation began with small but meaningful changes to my daily routine. I started taking morning walks along the Brooklyn Heights promenade, something I had stopped doing because Sandra always made comments about the dangers of elderly people exercising alone. I enrolled in a painting class at the local community center, rediscovering a passion I had abandoned when family obligations consumed all my free time. Most importantly, I began saying no to requests that didn't respect my time or energy. When Michael called asking me to babysit at the last minute so he and Sandra could attend a social event, I declined. When Sandra sent me a list of household tasks she needed help with, I ignored it. When they invited me to family dinners where I would be ignored or treated as an obligation, I made other plans. Each refusal felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I had given away without realizing its value. I was remembering what it felt like to live according to my own priorities and preferences, rather than constantly adapting to other people's expectations. The most dramatic change came when I decided to redecorate my bedroom, the space Sandra had tried to claim as her own. I hired a designer and chose colors and furnishings that reflected my personality, rather than trying to remain invisible and inoffensive. The room became a sanctuary that was unmistakably mine, filled with art I loved, furniture that made me comfortable, and memories I chose to display. When Emma came to visit and saw the transformation, her face lit up with delight. "Grandma, this is so beautiful," she said, bouncing on the new chair I had positioned by the window. "It looks like you." It was exactly the reaction I had hoped for. For the first time in years, my living space reflected who I was, rather than who other people wanted me to be. The bedroom that Sandra had tried to claim now stood as a testament to my refusal to be erased from my own life. But the real test of my newfound strength came 6 months after our initial confrontation, when Michael and Sandra appeared at my door unannounced, with what they clearly thought was an irresistible offer. "Mom, we've been thinking about everything that happened," Michael said, his voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and conciliatory. "We realize we made some mistakes, and we want to make things right." Sandra stood beside him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, holding a bouquet of flowers that looked like they had been grabbed from a grocery store display. "We've come up with a solution that we think will work for everyone," she said. They had prepared a presentation that they delivered with the confidence of people who had never doubted their ability to manipulate me back into compliance. They offered to give me a different bedroom in the apartment, one that was smaller but had its own bathroom. In exchange, I would turn over the master bedroom to them and contribute a substantial sum toward renovation costs. "We're willing to let you stay in the apartment," Sandra said, as if this were a generous concession rather than an acknowledgement of my legal rights as the owner. "But we need to make some changes to accommodate our growing family." They had clearly expected me to be grateful for this offer, to see it as a compromise that proved their willingness to consider my needs. But I saw it for what it was: another attempt to take what they wanted while making me pay for the privilege of being displaced in my own home. I listened to their entire presentation without interruption, letting them build their case while I observed their body language and the assumptions underlying their proposal. When they finished, they looked at me expectantly, confident that they had found a way to get what they wanted while maintaining the illusion of fairness. "No," I said simply. The single word hung in the air between us, clear and final. I didn't elaborate or justify my refusal. I didn't apologize for disappointing them or offer alternative solutions. I simply said no and let them process the implications. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally anger. "Mom, you're not even going to consider it? We're trying to be fair here." "Fair to whom?" I asked. "You want me to give up the bedroom I've slept in for 45 years? Pay thousands of dollars for renovations that benefit you? And be grateful for the privilege of being relocated to a smaller space in my own home? How is that fair to me?" Sandra's mask slipped again, revealing the aggressive entitlement that had always lurked beneath her false concern. "We have children, Eleanor. Growing children who need space and stability. Don't their needs matter to you?" "Their needs matter very much to me," I replied. "That's why their parents should provide for them in their own home, not demand that their grandmother subsidize and accommodate their choices." I could see them recalibrating again, searching for the argument that would break my resistance. They had never encountered a version of me who couldn't be guilted, manipulated, or worn down through persistence. Michael tried appealing to my love for the grandchildren, a tactic that had worked many times in the past. "The kids miss you, Mom. They don't understand why Grandma doesn't want to see them anymore." The emotional manipulation was skillful but transparent. I had continued to maintain relationships with my grandchildren through direct communication and individual visits. The only thing that had changed was my willingness to attend family gatherings where I was marginalized and disrespected. "The children are welcome to visit me anytime," I said. "What they're not welcome to witness is their parents treating me with disrespect and contempt. I won't teach them that it's acceptable to mistreat elderly family members." Sandra finally abandoned all pretense of civility. "You're being incredibly selfish, Eleanor. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By making our lives more difficult when we're just trying to build a future for our family?" The accusation of selfishness was predictable but still stung. I had spent decades prioritizing other people's needs over my own, giving away time, money, and emotional energy without keeping track of the cost to my own well-being. Now, the first time I had prioritized my own needs, I was being called selfish by people who had never hesitated to put their own interests first. "I'm being self-respecting," I corrected. "There's a difference. Selfishness would be demanding that you rearrange your lives to suit my preferences. Self-respect is refusing to rearrange my life to suit yours." They left that day with a coldness that felt final. No more attempts at manipulation or reconciliation, no more false promises or emotional appeals. They had played all their cards and realized that the woman they thought they could control had disappeared, replaced by someone who valued her own dignity more than their approval. The silence that followed their departure was profound, but not empty. It was filled with possibility, with the freedom to make choices based on my own values and priorities, rather than the need to placate people who would never be satisfied. Over the next several months, I discovered what it meant to live authentically at 70 years old. I traveled to places I had always wanted to see, but had never visited because family obligations or financial requests had consumed my resources. I took classes, made new friends, and pursued interests that had nothing to do with being useful to other people. The most surprising discovery was how much energy I had when I stopped walking on eggshells around people who were determined to find fault with me. Without the constant stress of managing difficult family dynamics, I slept better, laughed more, and found joy in everyday experiences that I had been too exhausted to appreciate. Emma continued to visit regularly, and our relationship deepened as she watched me transform from a diminished, anxious woman into someone confident and self-possessed. During one of our conversations, she asked me a question that revealed her own struggles with family pressure. "Grandma, how did you learn to stop caring what other people think about you?" "I didn't stop caring," I told her. "I learned to care more about what I think about myself. When you respect yourself, you attract respect from others. When you don't respect yourself, you attract people who will take advantage of that." She nodded thoughtfully, and I could see her processing this lesson for her own life. Teaching her about self-respect and boundaries felt like one of the most important gifts I could give her, far more valuable than the financial support I had provided for so many years. But the real test of my transformation came almost a year later, when I received a phone call that challenged everything I thought I had learned about standing firm in my convictions. Michael's voice was different when he called, stripped of the manipulative undertones that had characterized our recent interactions. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important. Sandra and I are getting divorced." The news hit me with unexpected force. Despite everything that had happened between us, I felt a surge of concern for my son and his children. Divorce was never easy, especially with young children involved, and I knew that Michael was probably struggling with guilt, fear, and uncertainty about the future. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "How are you handling it? How are the kids?" We talked for an hour, the longest conversation we had shared in months. Michael told me about the problems in his marriage that had existed long before our confrontation, about Sandra's controlling behavior toward him and the children, about his growing realization that the dynamic in their relationship was unhealthy for everyone involved. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us," he said toward the end of our conversation. "I realize now that Sandra was the one pushing for all those changes to your apartment. I just went along with it because it was easier than fighting with her." I felt a mixture of validation and sadness at this admission. I was glad that he finally understood how his wife had treated me, but I was also saddened by the years of damage that could have been avoided if he had been willing to stand up to her earlier. "I'm not making excuses for my behavior," he continued. "I should have protected you from her. I should have stood up for you the way Dad always did. I failed you as a son, and I'm sorry." The apology was genuine and long overdue, but it also presented me with a choice. I could use this moment to rebuild our relationship, to return to the family dynamic that had existed before Sandra's influence became so toxic. Or I could maintain the boundaries I had established and insist that any future relationship be built on mutual respect, rather than guilt and obligation. "I appreciate your apology," I said carefully, "but I need to know that you understand what happened wasn't just about Sandra's influence. You made choices too. You chose to go along with her demands. You chose not to defend me. You chose to treat me as if my feelings didn't matter." There was a long pause before he responded. "You're right. I did make those choices, and I'm going to have to live with the consequences of them. I just hope that someday you'll be willing to give me a chance to do better." I told him I would consider it, but that any future relationship would need to be built slowly and based on consistent, respectful behavior, rather than grand gestures or promises. I had learned too much about my own worth to accept anything less than genuine respect from anyone, including my own son. Over the following months, Michael did make an effort to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. He consulted me before making decisions that affected the grandchildren, included me in family activities as an honored guest rather than unpaid labor, and stopped asking for financial support while he worked to establish his independent stability. The change in him was gradual but real. Without Sandra's influence, he seemed to rediscover the respectful, thoughtful person he had been before marriage, and financial pressures had twisted his priorities. Our conversations became genuine exchanges rather than one-sided reports of his needs and problems. But the most significant change was in how he talked to his children about me. Instead of the subtle dismissal and patronizing comments that had characterized Sandra's approach, he spoke of me with respect and affection. The grandchildren began to see me as a strong, independent woman worthy of admiration rather than a fragile burden requiring management. Emma, now 16 and increasingly mature, told me one day that I had become her role model. "I want to be like you when I'm older, Grandma. I want to be someone who stands up for herself and doesn't let people walk all over her." Her words filled me with a pride I hadn't expected. Throughout this difficult journey, I had worried that standing up for myself would damage my relationships with the grandchildren, that they would remember me as the difficult grandmother who caused problems for their parents. Instead, I had shown them what it looked like for a woman to value herself, and they had learned from that example. Looking back on that September morning when Sandra declared that my room was theirs, I can see now that it was the beginning of my rebirth rather than another loss in a series of diminishments. Her words, intended to erase me from my own life, instead awakened a strength I had forgotten I possessed. I learned that respect is not something you can earn through endless giving and self-sacrifice. It's something you claim by refusing to accept less than you deserve. I learned that love without respect is not love at all, but a transaction in which one person's needs are consistently prioritized over another's dignity. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your life, even at 70 years old. The woman who stood silent while her daughter-in-law measured her bedroom for renovations is gone, replaced by someone who understands her own worth and insists that others recognize it too. My apartment is still the same 3-bedroom space in Brooklyn Heights, but it feels completely different now. Every room reflects my choices, my preferences, my right to exist comfortably in the space I have earned through a lifetime of work and sacrifice. The bedroom that Sandra tried to claim is now a sanctuary that represents my refusal to disappear. I still have difficult days when I question whether the price of self-respect was too high, when I wonder if I could have found a way to maintain family harmony without sacrificing my dignity. But then I remember how it felt to be invisible in my own life, to have my needs dismissed and my feelings ignored by people who claim to love me. The peace I feel now, sitting in my own space, surrounded by things I have chosen and people who genuinely value my company, is worth more than any family gathering where I would have been tolerated rather than welcomed. I am no longer willing to buy love with my self-respect, or maintain relationships that require me to shrink myself to make others comfortable. Mrs. Rodriguez and I still share evening conversations on our balconies, watching the sunset over Manhattan while we toast to women who refuse to disappear. She has become the sister I never had, the friend who sees my full worth and reflects it back to me when I occasionally forget. Emma visits every Sunday now, and we spend our time talking about her dreams and plans for the future. I tell her stories about my own young adulthood, the choices I made, and the lessons I learned. I want her to understand that she has the right to take up space in the world, to have opinions and preferences that matter, to insist on respect from everyone in her life. The financial security that I had almost allowed others to control has given me options I never imagined having. I can travel when I want to, hire help when I need it, and live according to my own priorities without considering the opinions of people who don't have my best interests at heart. But the most valuable thing I gained through this experience wasn't money or independence, though both are important. It was the rediscovery of my own voice, my own worth, my own right to exist fully in the world without apology or justification. There are still moments when I feel the echoes of old programming trying to pull me back toward people-pleasing and self-sacrifice. But now I recognize those impulses for what they are. Habits learned in a time when I didn't understand my own value. I have new habits now, healthier patterns that prioritize my well-being alongside my relationships with others. When Sandra declared that my room was hers, she thought she was claiming territory from a weak woman who would offer no resistance. Instead, she awakened a strength that transformed not just my living situation, but my entire approach to life and relationships. 5 minutes after she spoke those words, I began the process of showing everyone in my family who really owned not just the house, but my own life. The answer, it turned out, was simple. I did. I always had. I had just forgotten for a while. What happened in the months that followed surprised everyone, including myself. As I reclaimed my space and my dignity, I also discovered aspects of myself that had been dormant for years. The woman who emerged from this confrontation was not just the Eleanor who had existed before Sandra's manipulations, but a stronger, more self-aware version of myself. I started writing again, something I had abandoned when teaching and family responsibilities consumed all my time. My journals from that period reveal a woman discovering her own voice after decades of modulating it to avoid conflict. I wrote about Robert, about our early years together when we were partners in every sense of the word. I wrote about the slow erosion of that partnership model in my relationship with my son and his wife, how I had allowed myself to become a junior partner in my own life. The writing process was therapeutic, but it also served a practical purpose. I was documenting my mental competency for legal purposes, creating a record that would protect me if Sandra ever tried to follow through on her plans to gain power of attorney. Each entry demonstrated my clear thinking, my rational decision-making, and my complete understanding of my own situation. One entry from that time particularly stands out to me now. Today, I realized that I have been living as if I were already dead, as if my life were over and I were just waiting for others to dispose of my remains. But I am not dead. I am 70 years old, healthy, financially secure, and fully capable of making my own decisions. The only thing that was dead was my sense of my own worth, and that can be resurrected. Mrs. Rodriguez read that entry when I shared it with her during one of our evening conversations. She nodded approvingly and said something that became a guiding principle for the new phase of my life. Mija, you cannot live other people's lives for them, and they cannot live yours for you. Each person must take responsibility for their own happiness. This wisdom helped me navigate the complex emotions I felt about Michael's divorce. Part of me wanted to swoop in and fix things, to provide financial support and emotional labor to ease his transition. It would have been so easy to fall back into the pattern of sacrificing my own stability to cushion other people's difficulties. But I had learned too much about boundaries to make that mistake again. Instead, I offered what I was willing to give: emotional support during our phone conversations, occasional babysitting when I genuinely wanted to spend time with the grandchildren, and advice when it was requested rather than imposed. The difference in Michael's response was immediately apparent. Instead of taking my support for granted, he expressed genuine gratitude. Instead of assuming I would solve his problems, he approached me as one adult consulting another. The dynamic between us shifted from parent-child to adult-adult, and our relationship became stronger as a result. Emma noticed the change too. During one of our Sunday visits, she commented on how different her father seemed when he talked about me. "He actually listens when you speak now, Grandma. Before, it was like he was just waiting for his turn to tell you what he needed." Her observation was astute and painful. I had been so focused on being needed that I had taught my son to see me as a resource rather than a person. Breaking that pattern required me to stop being endlessly available and start being selectively present. The process of reclaiming my life also involved reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with over the years. During my marriage, Robert and I had shared a social circle that revolved around couples' activities. After his death, I had gradually withdrawn from those connections, partly from grief and partly because Sandra had made subtle comments about my social activities taking time away from family obligations. But now, liberated from the need to justify my choices to people who didn't respect them anyway, I reached out to old friends and was amazed by the warmth of their responses. Many of them had been going through their own struggles with adult children, aging parents, and the complex dynamics of extended family relationships. My friend Margaret, whom I had known since our teaching days, invited me to join a book club that met monthly at the local library. The group consisted of women in their 60s and 70s who had fascinating perspectives on literature, life, and the challenges of aging with dignity in a culture that often dismissed older women. Our discussions ranged far beyond the books we read. We talked about everything from financial planning to dating after widowhood, from dealing with difficult family members to pursuing new interests in our later years. Each woman had stories of finding her voice after decades of putting others first, of learning to value herself after years of being undervalued by people who claimed to love her. These friendships became a crucial source of support and validation. When I occasionally doubted my decision to stand up to Michael and Sandra, these women reminded me of my worth and celebrated my courage. They had watched their own friends be diminished by manipulative family members, and they understood the strength it took to say no to people who felt entitled to yes. One particularly meaningful conversation occurred during our discussion of The Awakening by Kate Chopin. The protagonist's journey toward self-realization despite social pressure resonated with all of us in different ways. "The tragedy of Edna Pontellier," said my friend Helen, "is that she lived in a time when women had so few options for authentic self-expression. We're lucky to be living in an era when we can choose independence without it being a death sentence." Her words struck me powerfully. I was living in a time and place where women had legal rights, financial options, and social support systems that previous generations could not have imagined. I had the tools to protect myself and live authentically. I just needed the courage to use them. That courage was tested again when Sandra made one final attempt to regain control of the situation, 6 months after her divorce from Michael was finalized. She called me on a Saturday morning, her voice sweet and conciliatory, in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Eleanor, I know things have been difficult between us," she began, "but I want you to know that I've learned a lot from this experience. I realize I made mistakes, and I want to make amends." I listened without responding, having learned that silence often revealed more than questioning. Sandra filled the pause with increasingly desperate attempts to regain my trust. "I think we both got caught up in the stress of trying to manage a difficult situation," she continued. "But we're family, and family should be able to work through their problems together. I'd like to take you to lunch so we can talk about moving forward." The offer was tempting in its apparent reasonableness, but I had learned to look beyond the surface of Sandra's communications to the agenda beneath. She was recently divorced, facing financial pressures as a single mother, and probably calculating how to regain access to my resources without Michael as an intermediary. "That's kind of you to offer," I said carefully, "but I'm not interested in having lunch or moving forward with any kind of relationship. We've already worked through our problems. The solution was for you to respect my boundaries, which you were unwilling to do." I could hear her recalibrating, searching for the approach that would breach my defenses. "I understand that you're angry," she said, "but holding on to anger isn't healthy for someone your age. Don't you think it would be better to forgive and move on?" The subtle ageism in her comment revealed her true feelings despite her conciliatory tone. I was an elderly woman who should be grateful for any attention, even from someone who had tried to steal my bedroom and financial independence. My anger was portrayed as unhealthy stubbornness rather than justified self-protection. "I'm not angry," I replied truthfully. "I'm boundary conscious. There's a big difference. Anger is an emotion that passes. Boundaries are protective structures that remain in place to prevent future harm." Sandra tried several more tactics during that phone call. Appeals to the grandchildren's need for family harmony, suggestions that I was being influenced by outside parties against her, even hints that my social isolation was affecting my judgment. Each attempt revealed her fundamental inability to understand that I was making informed, rational decisions about my own life. When she finally realized that no amount of manipulation was going to change my position, her mask slipped one final time. "Fine, Eleanor. But don't expect me to make it easy for you to see the kids. Their father and I may be divorced, but we agree on protecting them from toxic family dynamics." The threat was clear: comply with her wishes or lose access to my grandchildren. It was a cruel calculation designed to exploit my love for them against my need for self-respect. A year earlier, this threat might have worked, but the woman Sandra was trying to manipulate no longer existed. "If you choose to use the children as weapons to punish me for having boundaries," I said, "that decision will reflect on your character, not mine. I will continue to be available to them when and if they seek me out, regardless of what you or anyone else thinks about my choices." That phone call marked the end of Sandra's attempts to regain influence over my life. I suspect she finally realized that the compliant, easily manipulated Eleanor was gone forever, replaced by someone who valued her own dignity more than other people's approval. The years that followed brought unexpected joys and challenges. Michael's transformation into a respectful, appreciative son was gradual but genuine. He learned to approach me as an equal rather than a resource, to value my advice rather than simply expecting my compliance, and to include me in family decisions as a voice that mattered. The grandchildren, freed from the toxic dynamic that had characterized family gatherings when Sandra was part of them, began to flourish in their relationships with me. Emma continued to visit regularly, but now her younger siblings joined her, eager to spend time with the grandmother who had become a source of strength and wisdom rather than a burden to be managed. These children, watching me stand up for myself and create a life based on my own values, learned lessons that will serve them throughout their lives. They saw that age didn't automatically mean powerlessness, that women could be strong and independent at any stage of life, and that respect was something that must be insisted upon rather than simply hoped for. My financial advisor, James, became not just a professional service provider but a trusted ally in protecting my independence. He helped me establish additional legal safeguards for my assets, recommended estate planning attorneys who specialized in preventing elder abuse, and celebrated each milestone in my journey toward complete autonomy. "Mrs. Williams," he told me during our annual review meeting, "you've become one of my most inspiring clients. You took control of your situation when many people would have simply accepted unfair treatment. You're a role model for how to age with dignity and strength." His validation meant a great deal to me, but it was secondary to the validation I had learned to give myself. I no longer needed other people's approval to know that I was making good choices. I had developed an internal compass that pointed toward self-respect, and I trusted it more than any external authority. The process of writing this story, of putting these experiences into words that might help others in similar situations, has been both painful and healing. Revisiting those moments of manipulation and confrontation reminds me of how vulnerable I once felt, how uncertain I was of my own worth and rights. But it also reminds me of the strength I discovered within myself, the courage I didn't know I possessed until circumstances demanded it. Every woman who has ever been diminished by family members who claim to love her, every person who has ever been told that their needs don't matter as much as everyone else's, carries within them the same potential for self-liberation. The bedroom that Sandra tried to claim remains my sanctuary, but it has evolved into something more than just a place to sleep. It has become a symbol of my refusal to disappear, a daily reminder that I have the right to exist fully in my own space. The walls hold artwork that speaks to me, memory and photograph that tell the story of a life lived authentically rather than performed for other people's approval. Mrs. Rodriguez, my dear friend and fellow survivor of family manipulation, passed away peacefully in her sleep last year at the age of 85. In her final weeks, she often spoke about the satisfaction of having lived her last years on her own terms, surrounded by people who genuinely valued her company rather than her usefulness. At her memorial service, person after person spoke about her strength, her wisdom, her refusal to accept less than she deserved from anyone. Her children, who had initially been frustrated by her boundaries, had eventually learned to respect them and had developed healthier relationships with her as a result. "She taught us that love isn't about taking whatever we can get," her daughter said in her eulogy. "It's about giving and receiving respect, about seeing each other as complete human beings worthy of dignity and consideration." Mrs. Rodriguez left me her recipe box, a collection of handwritten cards that represented decades of nurturing her family while never losing sight of her own worth. Each recipe is annotated with notes about family gatherings, special occasions, and the joy of creating beautiful things for people who appreciated them. But tucked between the recipes for tamales and tres leches cake, I found something else. A letter addressed to me, written in her careful handwriting. "Querida Eleanor," it read, "you have become the daughter I never had, the sister I always needed. Watching you reclaim your life has been one of the great privileges of my final years. Never forget that strength is not about avoiding conflict, but about standing firm for what is right even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. You are a warrior, mija. Act like one." The letter sits framed on my nightstand now, next to Robert's reading glasses and Emma's latest school photo. These objects represent the different chapters of my life, the devoted wife I was, the proud grandmother I remain, and the fierce protector of my own dignity I have become. Emma is now 18 and preparing for college. She chose a school in California, far from the family dynamics that once consumed so much energy, but she sends me long letters describing her classes, her new friends, and her growing understanding of herself as a young woman with unlimited potential. "Grandma," she wrote in her most recent letter, "I think about what you went through with Mom and Dad, and it makes me determined never to accept that kind of treatment from anyone. You showed me what it looks like to value yourself enough to fight for respect. That's the most important lesson anyone ever taught me." Her words fill me with a pride that goes beyond typical grandmother satisfaction. I have passed on something more valuable than money or possessions. The knowledge that women have the right to take up space, to have opinions that matter, to insist on dignity in all their relationships. The other grandchildren, now teenagers themselves, have also benefited from witnessing my transformation. They've learned to approach me with genuine curiosity about my thoughts and experiences, rather than the patronizing concern that once characterized family interactions. They ask my advice about school problems, relationship issues, and future plans because they've learned that I have wisdom worth consulting. Michael, now fully established in his post-divorce life, has become the son I always hoped he could be. He calls regularly, not because he needs something, but because he genuinely enjoys our conversations. He includes me in his decision-making, not because I demand it, but because he values my perspective. Most importantly, he has learned to see me as a complete person rather than just his mother. He asks about my interests, my friendships, my plans for the future. He celebrates my independence rather than treating it as a problem to be solved. "Mom," he said during one of our recent phone calls, "I owe you an apology that goes deeper than what I've already said. I spent years seeing you as someone whose job was to make my life easier. I never considered that you had needs and dreams of your own. Thank you for standing up for yourself, even when it meant standing up to me." His apology was complete and heartfelt, but it wasn't what I needed to hear to feel whole. I had learned that my worth didn't depend on other people's recognition of it. His respect was welcome, but it wasn't required for me to respect myself. This understanding came with both freedom and responsibility. Freedom from the exhausting work of trying to earn love through endless giving, but responsibility for creating a life that reflected my own values and priorities. No one else could live my life for me or make my choices for me. That was both the burden and the gift of true independence. As I approach my 75th birthday, I reflect on the unexpected trajectory of my later years. The woman who once apologized for taking up space now speaks confidently in public settings, offers opinions without prefacing them with disclaimers, and makes decisions based on her own judgment rather than other people's expectations. I have traveled to places I had only dreamed of visiting, taken classes in subjects that fascinated me, and cultivated friendships based on mutual interest and respect rather than family obligation or social convenience. I have discovered that the life I thought was ending when Sandra tried to claim my bedroom was actually just beginning. The story of how I reclaimed my dignity is not unique. Across the world, women are learning to value themselves after decades of putting everyone else first. They are discovering their own voices after years of modulating them to avoid conflict. They are claiming their right to exist fully in spaces they have earned through lifetimes of work and sacrifice. To any woman reading this who recognizes herself in my story, I want you to know, it is never too late to insist on respect. It is never too late to claim your own space. It is never too late to live authentically, even if authenticity disappoints people who preferred you diminished. You do not owe anyone your dignity as payment for their love. You do not owe anyone your independence as proof of your gratitude. You do not owe anyone your voice as a sacrifice for their comfort. What you owe yourself is the courage to stand firm in your worth, even when standing firm costs you everything you thought you wanted. The bedroom Sandra tried to claim still holds the same furniture, still gets the same morning light, still overlooks the same river. But everything about it has changed, because everything about me has changed. It is no longer just a room where I sleep. It is a declaration of my right to exist fully in my own life, a daily reminder that I am the author of my own story. When people ask me if I regret the confrontation that changed everything, if I wish I had found a way to maintain family harmony without asserting my boundaries, I think about the woman I was before Sandra spoke those 5 words that awakened my strength. That woman was disappearing a little more each day, accepting less respect, surrendering more autonomy, buying love with pieces of her soul. I would not trade the peace I feel now for all the artificial harmony in the world. I would not trade my hard-won self-respect for the approval of people who could only love me when I made myself small enough to fit their expectations. This room is mine now. This life is mine now. This voice is mine now. 5 minutes after Sandra declared her intention to claim what was never hers to take, I began the journey of showing everyone, including myself, who really owned not just the space I lived in, but the life I chose to live. The answer was always simple, even when I had forgotten it. I did. Today, I want you to think about the rooms in your own life, the spaces and relationships where others might be making assumptions about your rights and your worth. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Have you ever had someone dismiss your needs as if they didn't matter? Have you ever been asked to sacrifice your dignity to keep the peace? If any of this feels familiar, I hope my story reminds you that it's never too late to reclaim your space, your voice, and your right to be treated with respect. You don't have to disappear to make others comfortable. You don't have to buy love with your self-respect. You don't have to accept less than you deserve from anyone, even family members who claim to love you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a situation where family members expected you to sacrifice your needs for their convenience? How did it feel to finally say no to people who were used to hearing yes? If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own worth, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Every like and subscription helps me reach someone else who might need to hear that they matter, that their dignity is not negotiable, and that respect is not too much to ask for, even at 70 years old. Remember, this life is yours. This home is yours. This voice is yours. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.